Hey everyone. All right, so we're back for another Q&A. Amir Hess 52832 I'm not. How can you still be able to learn new technologies and languages? Because I think learning ability defines how powerful the developer is. Get comfortable with reading documentation, whether you're learning a new language, whether you're integrating a new framework, or even just a library. Let's go with a library for now. Get comfortable with reading the documentation and the basically a tutorial that the developers wrote for whatever you're using. You will often get it's very convenient when you get beautifully written tutorials from teachers or writers that are very good writers, and they're able to explain things in a very human readable way. And sometimes developers aren't always able to do that. That's why writing documentation, that's why sometimes you see poorly written documentation and sometimes it's written beautifully. But get comfortable with reading documentation. That is an essential skill that you absolutely should pick up as you grow as a developer. So let me give you an example. Let's say you are working on a project, and project goals, project deadlines, or business goals require you to integrate a library that hooks up very well for their analytics software. And it may not make a whole lot of sense on the development side to be able to integrate that, and it doesn't really intertwine well with your already existing app. But you have to figure it out anyways. And now you all of a sudden need to be able to implement this library in a way in which you cannot find a single tutorial to spell it out for you. You have to piece things together. And when you don't have a lot of tutorials based on teaching you what you need to learn, documentation is always your fallback. Documentation is always going to get you where you need to be. 99% of the time when it's not written poorly, but you hope the documentation is written well. So as you get better at reading documentation for a library, a framework, whatever you're trying to pick up, it's a skill that you build. Not the skill of reading that documentation, but just being able to read documentation and integrate that into your custom solution and how you want to use the library. And so when you get better with that, you build up a skill that you're able to take with you to other frameworks and libraries. And it gets a little bit easier. And you start recognizing when a documentation is written poorly versus written very well. But you get better at looking things up. You get better at reading. You get better at learning. So getting better at reading documentation is an essential skill that you should not shy away from. And a lot of developers do, especially in the beginning, they shy away from learning something new through documentation. They usually jump right to the tutorials, which isn't a bad thing, but then they don't really understand how they're using this framework that's so integrated into their app. And there comes a point where you're going to probably want to do things with that framework that you're not comfortable doing. And you have that ability, you have that depth of knowledge with that framework when you've spent a little bit of time with basically a tutorial documentation that the developers themselves wrote. So get better at reading documentation. Okay, so that's number one by far. Number two, know how you learn. So I've kind of developed a pattern in which if I were to learn something brand new from start to finish, there's never a finish, but let's say I'm starting brand new, I'm a beginner with this topic, I love diving into the fundamentals. So I'll usually start with kind of an introduction tutorial that the developers wrote in their documentation. And what I'll usually do is I'll skim the documentation and then jump into video type tutorials that will go over building a project with that library. And then I will kind of build, not the project that they're building, but I'll kind of build my own project that's using the library or framework in a very similar way. So I can't necessarily rely on their tutorial line for line. So I need to kind of understand why they're writing what they're writing. And basically, what is the code really doing? And so I'll go through kind of a beginner tutorial like that, build my own custom project, and then really jump back into the documentation and start reading kind of some of the more detailed sections. Documentation can be kind of dry sometimes. It depends how it's written. But try to, whenever you're picking up something, I think it's important to, and I think this is a common mistake, I think most people will just have the illusion of understanding what they're reading because it's written well, and so they'll read, you know, chapters in a book, they'll read the entire documentation all at once, and it's written so well that they understand it as they're going, but then when they click the X on that window and then dive into their own project to be able to integrate that, they draw a blank. It's because they didn't really apply the concepts they were learning to be able to retain them and be able to retrieve them later. So number one, get comfortable with reading documentation. 2, learn how to learn. Get comfortable with that. You can kind of figure out how you pick up things best by just trying different methods. And really, that's the only piece of advice I have with that. So try different things, see what works for you, and just apply it to the next project or whatever you need to pick up. So that's it.
I've been cold to you, but you want nothing to do with me. So hopefully we'll coexist in time.